Hi everyone, today we are going to be reading a short story called This Way Nobody Gets the Blame by Leslie Grant-Adamson. This way, he said, nobody gets the blame. Ella gave him a teasing look, which he missed because he was striding along quite quickly considering how much he had to carry. But he had sounded so proud that she couldn't resist saying, "It was very clever of you to work it all out, Phil." He took the remark seriously. "You too, Ella, just as much your plan as it is mine." "Well, whoever it belongs to, let's hope it works." This time he stopped and looked at her. "You haven't spotted a flaw. I mean, if there's anything not quite right, now is the time to—" No, it's perfect." "You're sure?" "Honestly, it's foolproof." "And it's as good as done." He began to walk again, his waterproof jacket rustling. The path narrowed, and Ella trailed behind him. Over to the right, the sea heaved against a rocky shore. For the rest, there was an empty hinterland with sunlight fading on granite walls and closing salty fields. Philip urged her on with an impatient toss of his head, but she thought it added a touch of normality if she were dawdling, so she didn't hurry. So, really quickly here, Ella and Phil are walking on a narrow path at the bottom of a cliff when there's ocean right next to it. So they're walking on at the bottom of a cliff here with a really rocky, strong ocean next to them. And there's some type of plan. "Come on." He took up a studied, relaxed stance while waiting for her. He was a terribly unconvincing actor, his irritation undisguised. She had experienced a lot of it lately. Nobody would have dreamed that the whole mess was his fault, not hers. "I am the innocent victim," she thought dreamily as she watched the waves rushing to destruction. She turned the dreamy look into a smile as she drew nearer to her husband. "I'm trying to look natural, Phil. We shouldn't dash as though we expect every wave to be our last. I don't remember rehearsing this dithering when we did our trial runs." She winced at the unfortunate word trial, but Philip appeared not to notice and strode on. After a few paces, he ushered her past him, so that from then on he was following her, or rather he was shepherding her down the path. So now they switched places, and Phil is now behind Ella. They passed the kink where the big stone had broken free, and the surface was slippery. Ella skipped swiftly on, but she heard her husband's boots slide on the scree. He was fond of those boots. He'd had them for years, and there had been too many slips for her to believe they gripped well. Philip hadn't proved sure-footed in other figurative ways either. He had made a mess of his business and a worse one in borrowing to wriggle out of trouble. And then he had done the very silly thing. So everything from here on is kind of a flashback telling us what happened to lead them up to this point of them being at the bottom of a cliff. Like everything else about him, his mistake, his crime was unoriginal. It used to be called borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, but now there were bleaker ways of describing it: misappropriation, fraud, embezzlement. They came to the same thing. He had stolen money. "We're in a fix," he admitted to Ella, the day he told her about the huge debt, the investor who had been plundered, and the sham their lives had become. "You mean we'll have to sell Silver Acre?" She loved the old house and its cozy disposition in a hollow overlooking the sea, and the status that being its owner conferred on her. She had never been comfortable before. Her childhood had been poor, and in the years when Philip was building his business, they'd scraped by in a bungalow on a modern estate. At Silver Acre, she felt truly at home for the first time in her life. When he didn't answer her question, she had another one. "Who else knows about this?" "Nobody." "Not even Heidi?" "Not even her." Heidi was his assistant, an Austrian woman with bright blue eyes and a sing-song accent. At one time, Ella suspected that she was rather closer to him than that, but Philip had persuaded her not to. So at one point, Ella was suspicious that Philip might have been cheating on her with his assistant Heidi. "Is there nothing else we can do?" He gave a bitter laugh. "Not to save the house. We offered it as security, and the bank will take it. Are we going bankrupt? He spoke flatly as though explaining to someone especially dim. We're going to be bankrupt, and I'm probably going to be in prison. But what? Don't you think I've thought all around this before I decided to tell you? Yes, I'm sure you did. It had always been his way to do things and then tell her after. She used to protest at him shutting her out, but it made no difference because it was his nature. For a second, she was so angry with him that she didn't care whether he went to prison or not. It would be what he deserved for wrecking her life as well as his own, she thought. But the thought was very brief. There must be a way, she said. And she saw from his face that he thought so too. But before long, they were plotting. The path turned into rugged steps, so now we're back in the present when they're on the cliff here. Ella climbed down easily. On the first visit, she had found it tricky, but they had tramped this route 6 times since that evening of plotting. If anyone had cared to look, they would have noticed that a couple from Silver Acre liked to go fishing below the cliffs some evening. But no one would have guessed that one evening their car was to be abandoned where they usually parked it, near the start of the path, or that a van had been bought especially for them to flee in and lay hidden in a barn on the edge of their land, or that in its glove box there were fake passports, or that Philip had rounded up what was left of the money, a substantial amount as long as no debts were honored, and had transferred it abroad. Where these steps met the rocks, Ella paused once again and gazed around. A wave frothed toward her. The lower step was awash. Her boots and ankles were drenched. So if we stop here really quickly, we can kind of infer that Ella and Phil made a plan to fake their own death. So they made it look like they would like to go fishing every once in a while, but this time they're going to make it look like they drowned in the ocean, and they have a special car hidden so that they can get away. They got fake passports, and Philip transferred the rest of their money abroad. So they're going to try to fake their own death and get away so that they don't have to, go bankrupt and go to jail. So let's see how their plan turns out. Behind her, Philip said, "You see, if you hadn't been hanging about, we'd have been over without getting wet." He splashed past her and hoisted himself onto the rocks. "Come on," he shouted back. "Give me a hand with this." He leaped across while the water was receding, perched on her usual toehold, and reached the top of the rock. A buffeting wind was coming from the west. Waves were jagged white lines when they were far out, but whisked into fury near the shore. With a terrible sucking, the water snatched what it could from the land. While Philip battled to position their rods, she stayed where she was. They'd hoped for a lively sea to give credence to the idea that they have been swept away and drowned. So far, luck was with them. She couldn't just stand there watching him. He seemed to be having trouble with her rod, and he gestured for her to help. For a moment, she was rooted. Then she darted forward, keen to get it done. Ella sprang at him and pushed him over the edge. He had no chance in those slippery boots of his. She didn't hear him cry out, but she saw his astonishment. In the instant before she made contact, he had been turning toward her, arm outstretched. Her first thought, as he disappeared into the spray, was that she was fortunate to have avoided his clutching hands. If he had moved more quickly, or if she had been slower, he would certainly have gotten a grip on her sleeve, and she would have been plunged into the sea. So if we stop right here, this is an important part. So Phil was pretending to have problems with the fishing rod and asked Ella to come help him with it. Ella decided that she was done with her husband, so she actually pushed him over the edge of the rocks, and she basically kills her husband. But she realizes that it looked like Phil was going to try to grab onto her too and pull her over with him. So let's see how this plays out. Alone, she followed the escape route along the cliff top. Rain was blowing on the wind, and the light was as poor as she had hoped. Any lighter, and she might be recognized. Any darker, and she would need a torch. Soon the waves were turbulent ghosts on a black sea. She cut inland. At last, she drew close to the barn. Its door was rattling in the wind. Philip ought to have made it secure, she thought crossly. Supposing it had blown open and someone had noticed the van. Inside the barn, it was totally dark. She felt the van's bumper against her leg and squeezed round to the driver's door. As she opened it, everything collapsed in a whirlwind of confusion. A woman in the passenger's seat was gabbing at her in a sing-song voice, pawing at her. "Oh, Philip, I thought you would never come. How did it go? Did she suspect anything? It must have been absolutely terrible for you." So that is the end of the story. We have to infer a lot here. So if we think about it, the woman who was hiding out in their vehicle is Heidi, Philip's assistant. And she was there waiting for Philip to come and get her. So if we put all of the pieces together, it sounds like Philip had his own plan to kill his wife and escape with Heidi and the money. But Ella got to him first and killed her husband first. So that is the end of the story. So now make sure we go and answer the reading questions for the story and get those submitted to Canvas.